Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you, genuinely. Most of you listening right now are probably my friends, family, and colleagues, the real ones who decided to show up and support this little idea of mine. And I don't take that lightly. On Spotify alone, we crossed over 100 plays in the first 2 days. Now look, for some that's nothing. For me, that's a big deal. 100 people choosing to spend their time listening to something I created. Now, I also started an Instagram page to build some reach and visibility around the podcast. The first advert we put out crossed 20,000 views. 20,000. That's wild to me. So truly, thank you for the love, the shares, the follows, and the encouragement. It doesn't go unnoticed. Also, I know this segment is getting too big, but remember the friend from episode 1 who told me to just start? Yeah, he started a YouTube channel of his own called Notes from the Middle. Since it's Valentine's week, if you've had your heart broken or you know someone who has, he's put out something that talks about getting through it. So go show him some love and support. Support the good content. The link will be in the description below. And with that being said, welcome to In Progress with the Said. So I've been having fleeting thoughts about a few things. And the way I'm about to present to you may or may not be in a particular order. So just bear with me. What actually happens when certainty disappears? Not in a dramatic life falling apart way, just when the script you handled no longer works. When things are stable, when systems are clear, when rules are defined, we optimize for safety. We learn the boundaries and behave within them. We calculate risk. But when that stability drops, something shifts. That's where imposter syndrome thrives. That's also where the inner citadel tightens. That quiet voice that says, stay safe. Don't embarrass yourself. Wait till you're more ready. When at most times, you're often more ready than you think you're ready. I've also realized something. The inner citadel isn't exactly evil. It's protective. It was built in environments where safety mattered. But protection, if left unchecked, becomes limitation. At some point, you either retreat into that fortress or step into the arena. And here's the key. I didn't demolish my citadel. I negotiated with it. When I look back into my life so far, Saudi gave me the structure, and India gave me friction. Structure built my foundation, but friction built the growth I've had so far. So it's safe to say I initially grew up in an environment where systems were stable, reputation was inherited because people knew my parents, behavior was monitored because people knew my parents, risk was calculated, again because people knew my parents. Systems were quite predictable. And there's comfort in that. And then I moved to a place where not many knew my parents. No one knew my past. I mean, not that I had much to begin with. And I wasn't buffered by status. It gave me a sense of agency. These created psychological shifts because that's when I started to adapt. And maybe the prior global exposure gave me just enough perspective to adapt to, adaptations. So Saudi more or less created space for an open mind. India forced that mind to expand further. Now, friction in itself is uncomfortable by design. That's where imposter syndrome thrives. That's where leaps feel irrational. That's also where you feel like you're pretending. But that's also where identity becomes self-authored. But here's the thing. If discomfort forces you to grow, then how much of who you are actually comes from how you were raised. It's very easy to say, I'm like this because of my parents. I behave this way because of my childhood. But at what time does that stop being explanation and start becoming excuse? Now, recently I came across a write-up by Chris Williamson, a podcaster I, quite often listen to. He coined something called the parental attribution error. So essentially, it's a cognitive bias where individuals disproportionately blame their parents for their negative traits or life failures while taking personal credit for their own positive attributions and successes. Too much, right? Let me take out the psychological jargon. So essentially, parental attribution error is when someone says, all my problems are because of my parents. But when something goes right, that's all me. Now, imagine a guy called Jack. He struggles with anger issues. He says, it's because of my dad that was very short-tempered. That's why I'm like this. Or let's say Jack procrastinates a lot. He says, my parents never really disciplined me properly. But let's say when he's financially smart, he just goes saying, I'm just naturally responsible with money. Or when he's resilient after setbacks, he'd go, I've got mental toughness. That's just me. But who shaped your relationship with money? Who influenced how you handle stress? Now, I'm not saying it's entirely mom or dad, but it's not entirely you either. And this idea really stuck with me. Now, I highly recommend reading the entire write-up, but for now, I'm just going to read out 2 bits that sort of, resonated with me. You've labeled yourself a people pleaser because you had to keep the peace at home. But maybe that's also where your social fluency and emotional intelligence were born. You attribute your sensitivity to criticism to all the judgment you grew up with. But isn't that also what makes you thoughtful, receptive, and serious about getting better? Now, the idea of parental attribution error, the tendency to overcredit or overblame our parents for who we truly become, it sort of made me revisit my own childhood, a little differently this time. Now, growing up, my parents were quite well known and respected. They were doctors, so especially within the South Asian expat community, they were really well known. And what that meant for my brother and I was that we were never just kids. We were representatives. Our actions weren't just ours anymore, because we were, for the most part, watched with a lens. So we became careful. Too careful sometimes. We stayed disciplined, while other kids got to collect chaotic stories to tell when they'd grow up. Now, in these cases, you don't get to be reckless. Not because someone explicitly stops you, but because you understand the weight of reputation early. And at the time, that can feel like restriction. Like you fully didn't get the messy, uninhibited version of childhood. But here's where Chris's idea hits. It's easy for me to say, I was overly disciplined because of my environment. And that may be true. But stopping there would be over-attribution. Because that same discipline, that same awareness of conduct and emotional regulation now serves me in professional rooms. And that's the part where I personally feel I haven't acknowledged enough. Now, there's another layer as well. My parents were doctors. They worked long hours, odd shifts mostly. So I'd properly see them mostly on weekends. So for most of my upbringing, I was raised by housemaids. Now again, that statement can go 2 ways. One narrative says, I lacked parental presence. The other one would say, I developed emotional independence early. Because when adults are busy and you don't have constant parental supervision, you tend to learn to regulate yourself, emotionally at least. You realize that no one is going to micromanage your emotional world. And that does something powerful. It gives you agency. It forces you to take ownership of your narrative. It also builds observational intelligence. When you're raised by caretakers, but not fully immersed in parental emotional dialogue, you watch more than you speak. You study dynamics. You read rooms. And again, that helped me later, professionally, socially, internally. So now I try to see it this way. Understanding your conditioning is maturity. Blaming it indefinitely is just lazy and causes stagnation. Now, Chris isn't exactly asking anyone to excuse, any forms of abuse, neglect, or dysfunction, but rather build agency within. Look, self-accountability is uncomfortable, but unless we acknowledge, do what we have to, and move forward, we'd just be cultivating fragility. Now, I know I've said a lot on this, but trust me, I'm guilty of slipping into this mindset too. And it's something that I'm trying to actively work on. But I will leave you with this. The parental attribution error reminds us not to romanticize blame, because sometimes the same fire that could have burned you might be the one that forged you. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. This is Muhammad Asad, and you've been listening to In Progress with Asad.